Okay, so again, just for this little, difference over here, just a nice thing to do again, just so that you have it for yourself. Okay, if we look at allopatric speciation and we look at sympatric speciation, it's always a good idea just to make, a comparison. What you have over here is a physical barrier. Okay, and the physical barrier causes speciation. Again, a mountain range, animals that are not able to mix anymore, they've been isolated on either side of the mountain, and that has caused speciation. Sympatric speciation doesn't have to do with the physical barrier, okay, it has to do with reproductive isolating mechanisms. Okay, and you can name for yourself the 5 that we have just explained over there. Okay, so just one of the examples that I also want to focus on under allopatric speciation, okay, because we've done a couple now with sympatric speciation, is the idea again, which is where Darwin comes in and links nicely to the work that we did earlier, but the Galapagos Islands. Okay, and the Galapagos Islands, especially the idea of the finches that we see on those islands, is a very good example of geographic isolation. Okay, so speciation that has happened, allopatric speciation, okay, that has happened. And what we basically know about this whole idea is that there are finches in the Galapagos Islands that show a great deal of variation, and the idea is that they started from a common ancestor on one spot, okay, and because they flew and they got to different parts of the island, okay, and they settled on different islands, okay, and because of that they did not mix, there is a great deal of variation that is shown in, for example, things like their size and their beak structure. Now let's just say, because this is kind of the idea of how this whole thing works, okay? What happened is that in the beginning you had birds on all of those islands, okay? But what we found on island A, we can call it, is that there were lots of seeds available, okay? That was the predominant food source that we had there. Whereas if we look at, island B, there might have been a lot of fruit. Okay, and then on island C, there might have been flowers. Okay, so this would be the nectar that the birds would go for. And then on island D, there could be insects. All right, so the idea is that in the beginning, when finches came from the mainland and they got to these islands, okay, they were adapted to eating certain foods. And rather the idea is that there were certain foods on those islands, and unless you were adapted to eating seeds on island A, you were not going to survive. Okay? And if you could adapt and eat fruit on island B, you would have survived then, and so on and so on. So what we actually see is that because of the change in the food source that we had, birds became adapted. These finches showed variation. Again, the idea here is that speciation happened, again, because of natural selection, okay? Nobody ensured that there were seeds or fruit on these islands. It happened, okay? And the idea here is that birds that were adapted to eating seeds would have survived on island A. If you were a fruit eater, okay, so let's say you really relied on fruit and you couldn't adapt to eating seeds, the fruit-eating birds on island A would have eventually become extinct. They would have died out, okay, because if you can't adapt and eat a food source that is there, you're going to run into a problem. The same is true for island B. If you were a fruit-eating bird and there was lots of fruit on that island, you would have been okay, but the same is true if you were something, if you were a bird that needed insects. If you could not find insects on island B and you could not adapt to eating fruit, you would have died out and become extinct. So what did we see? What did Darwin see? He saw birds that showed great variation in beak size and shape. Okay, so for example, he saw beaks that were really sharp and they were actually quite small. Okay, then he saw beaks that were very long and thin. Okay, and these would probably have been adapted to eating nectar. Okay, then he saw beaks that were kind of normal size. They weren't really very long, they weren't really very big. Okay, and then he would have seen beaks that were very short, but very squat, very kind of fat, strong beaks. And this you would have, had for eating seeds. A really sharp beak, could have been for eating insects. And what you had over here is a beak that was adapted to eating fruit. So the idea is that these beaks were different. Okay, the beak size and shape was different. And why was it different? It was different because there was a barrier, okay, a water source over here between these islands. And also, though, because food supply was very different on these islands. Okay, if you were not adapted because of your beak size and even the size of the bird, okay, was something that came into play. Darwin saw that some birds were actually quite small, some were fairly medium-sized, okay, and remember this is also linking to the beak size that they have, and then some of the finches were actually very big. They were very big and they had nice big beaks, so it would have been a seed-eating bird, for example. So he saw this variation, okay, amongst these birds. He saw variation in the beak size, he saw variation in the size of the bird itself, okay, and his idea was that nature had selected these birds because allopatric speciation had happened, okay, because you had speciation happening, because there was a geographic barrier, something had separated these birds, to start with, and because the food supply, okay, was very different. It actually resulted in different species of finches that we see on these islands today. So the idea is that there was a common ancestor. There was one bird species that came kind of from Central and South America. Okay, when they were here, they all looked the same. It was one species of bird. And then they got to these different islands, okay, and over time, because they became adapted to eating certain food sources, because their size was, something that was taken into account, what we eventually see is a form of allopatric speciation, where Darwin's finches showed a great deal of variety or variation. Okay, and the variation was in the size of the bird itself, but the variation was also in the beak size that we see. Okay, so he had this idea that again there was a common ancestor. Because of allopatric speciation, what would have happened is that the food source would have been varied. There would have been a barrier of some sort, and this would have led to speciation of these finches on the different islands.